Welcome back to a brand new episode of No Truce Barred, the best up-and-coming podcast on the internet, and I'm your host, Hoikaweku Timmons, and this is episode 68 of No Truce Barred. If you've missed any of the previous 67 episodes, and if you've missed any of the previous episodes, you've been slacking big time. But if you've missed any of the previous 67 episodes, those episodes are available on Spotify, SoundCloud, Google Podcasts, and YouTube. And also with my YouTube channel, I'm gradually adding more audio content to YouTube. So I want to go back and I want to take some of those older episodes that people who subscribe to my YouTube channel weren't able to see. So look out for that over the next few weeks. I'm going to gradually pick a few episodes, put them up on the YouTube channel. You guys can check it out, like, comment, subscribe. So once again, I want to also thank everybody who has provided some feedback, everybody who's decided to share a piece of content. I also want to thank everybody who has been on the podcast. Thank you all. This podcast is something that I do from my heart. You know, my goal with this platform is to inform people and to also have people on that can provide information that may help you change your perspective on certain things that you thought were true. So this is the No Truce Barred platform. Also, make sure you follow me on Instagram _ No Truce Barred podcast. Make sure you follow me on my other Instagram page, which is Hoyt HOYT _ Kwaku KWAKU _ Timmons. That's TIMMONS. Also, make sure you follow me on Twitter at writer capital WRITER _ H Kwaku, so that's capital H KWAKU. Make sure you follow me on Twitter as well. Now, without further ado, man, I have to get into this because I'm so passionate about it. All of the misinformation, all of the propaganda we've been fed about marijuana, that really has been done at the behest of tobacco companies, at the behest of big pharma, at the behest of alcohol companies. There's been so much information, racism, mass incarceration, the war on drugs. All of these things can be tied into marijuana. Recently here in the state of Virginia, so first let's start with 2020. July 1st, 2020, marijuana was officially decriminalized here in the state of Virginia. So it was signed, it was Senate Bill 2, House Bill 972 that created a civil penalty of $25 for anybody who possessed up to an ounce of marijuana. If it was over that, I believe the fine was higher, and there could be possible jail time involved as well. But you had a lot of different community activist groups that was really pressing Governor Northam to legalize recreational marijuana a lot sooner, because initially what they were going to do was to wait until 2024 to legalize recreational marijuana. So as it stands here now in the state of Virginia, July 1st, 2021, you can possess up to an ounce of marijuana for recreational use. If you have over an ounce but under a pound of marijuana, then the civil penalty of $25 becomes a real thing, so you have to pay that. And then if you have a pound or more, then you can face possible jail time. Also, you cannot legally sell somebody marijuana, but you can gift it to them. And if you look at places like DC, that was something that DC was doing a lot, where you would come in and you would get gifted marijuana. So you would come into a dispensary or however they had it set up, and you would say, hey, I want to buy this piece of paraphernalia, or I want to buy this t-shirt. And you would pay the amount for the t-shirt, and you would just so happen to be gifted marijuana. So essentially that's what it is here. Like, you can give somebody marijuana, but you cannot actually sell the person marijuana. So that's where it stands now in Virginia. Also, if you're under the age of 21, you cannot possess any marijuana whatsoever. Also, you're allowed to grow up. You're allowed to have up to 4 plants in your home that you can grow for recreational uses. So this is where the state of Virginia stands as far as marijuana goes. I'm not really trying to thank Governor Northam as much as I want to thank the various community activist groups that really pressed our government to get rid of these archaic laws as it relates to marijuana, and to get rid of these archaic laws as it relates to mass incarceration. because many of these laws really go back to the 1930s, and many of these laws really have adversely affected Black households, really since the 1994 crime bill all the way up until now. You have, and then you get into like privately owned prisons as well. But this is what I want to do, because on No Truths Barred is about crumbling paradigms. No Truths Barred is about questioning your perspective and why exactly do you think the way that you think about laws, about these different substances. So let's look at it like this. In America, in the United States, there are over 88,000 alcohol-related car accidents and deaths per year in the United States. In recorded history, there has never been one death attributed to overconsumption of cannabis. Has not been found. Let's look at cigarettes, the tobacco industry. Now, cigarettes are one of the leading causes of lung cancer and various other types of cancers in this nation. Yet, it's allowed to be legal. Alcohol is allowed to be legal. If you get hooked on marijuana, from my research, it's more of a psychological addiction. So you wouldn't really have withdrawals. You really wouldn't have to get to the point where if you stop smoking marijuana, you'll develop flu-like symptoms. Now, with alcoholism, if you try to quit alcohol cold turkey, you're gonna die. You cannot quit alcohol cold turkey after you develop alcoholism. You cannot do it. You would actually die from the conditions that you would go through under withdrawal. Cigarettes, like I've read an article, and the article was talking about how former heroin addicts admitted that quitting cigarettes was a lot harder than quitting heroin. But yet these things are allowed to be legal. But let's go even further back. So, you remember back in the 1980s, Nancy Reagan had just say no, and you had to think this is your brain on drugs. And yes, hard substances like crack cocaine should be illegal. Hard substances like heroin should be illegal. But then when you start to think about cannabis, where does this come from? Why has America, for the past several decades, demonized a plant? And when you look at this plant throughout this plant's history in different cultures, we see not only was this plant useful in recreational purposes, but we also see the fact that this plant was used for its medicinal purposes as well. And so we're looking at cannabis that goes back thousands of years, and only within the past 50 or the past 70 or so years, it's been this big push by our government to demonize cannabis and to make it a Class 1 substance, which means that cannabis as a Class 1 substance is at the same level of cocaine, of heroin. Is like right there. So the way my mind works, whenever you tell me something, I have to go back and I have to begin to look into things for myself and to do my own research. So what I like to briefly talk about, like, how was this perceived in antiquity? How did our ancestors view the use of cannabis? So if you go back, there's a papyri or a papyrus called the Ebers Papyrus. It's a medical papyrus from ancient Egypt. It's dated to about 1550 BCE. It actually predates the Edwin Smith Papyrus, which is a huge medical papyrus, by about maybe 200 to 300 or so years. And so the Ebers Papyrus, it talks about a lot of different medical conditions. Like, one of the things that's really stunning about the Ebers Papyrus that you find in ancient Egypt is that it talks about the circulatory system, the function of the heart, and pumping blood, a lot of these different things, right? But also it gets into the use of the medicinal purposes that the ancient Egyptians had for cannabis. So even then, they used cannabis to treat glaucoma. as far back as 1550 BCE. And actually, let me correct myself, because the Ebers Papyrus was actually, according to some scholars, built upon an earlier papyrus that unfortunately has been lost to history. So the Ebers Papyrus talks about the fact that cannabis can be used for musculoskeletal issues. Its anti-inflammatory properties. It also talks about, like I said, the uses of cannabis in treating glaucoma. These are all things discussed in the Ebers Papyrus in ancient Egypt. Okay, so that's Egypt. Well, you're like, well, wait, that's one culture. You know, you can look at the Hindu texts in the Indus River Valley from 2000 BCE, where they use cannabis in religious ceremonies. It was a prominent thing to use cannabis in religious ceremonies. Okay, so we have the Indus River Valley. Okay, well, what about somebody else? Well, in Mesoamerican culture, cannabis was used recreationally. Like if you study the Maya and even the Aztecs, who would have came a lot later on, there was uses of cannabis. It was also used in religious ceremonies as well. If you look at Zoroastrianism, so you had the priesthood in Zoroastrianism, where they were called the Athravan, and these were the fire keepers. And out of this Athravan, you have what were called the Magus, or the Magi. And if you think you've heard that term somewhere before, you actually did, because the Magi are referenced in Matthew, I think 2:11, as the three wise men that visited Jesus with frankincense and myrrh. But you know, the Magi were astrologer priests from ancient Persia, and in their ceremonies they would use cannabis. They also many people in the Indus River Valley also use cannabis for what? Recreational purposes. So when we look back in our ancient past, we see this. We see that cannabis was used for all of these various recreational purposes. You know, we see that our ancestors didn't have this view. For example, like you could look at Galen, and Galen was a second century physician from Rome. And one of the things that Galen talked about is that, you know, we talk about cannabis infused foods now, but Galen mentioned that cannabis was often used and baked into desserts. It was baked into desserts. There were medical use for gastrointestinal issues, for muscle aches, for gout, for tremors. This is something that was mentioned in Rome. So we're seeing that, okay, in the ancient world, they did not have these hang-ups about cannabis usage in the ancient world. Okay. Interesting. But how about the American colonies? So one of the things, if you look at the colonists that came here in Jamestown, one of the things that the Crown forced them to do was to cultivate hemp. So hemp was actually used for ship sails. Hemp was used for clothes. Hemp was used for a myriad of things. And so the hemp industry was a big industry. And even you look at George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, you know, they grew hemp. You know, they spent a lot of money cultivating hemp and selling it. They also, you know, talked about the medicinal usages. The medicinal usage of cannabis. They also, Thomas Jefferson journaled about it. Now, this is where it gets a little murky, because some people will say, well, there is evidence that George Washington actually used cannabis recreationally. I've come across conflicting sources about that. It could be true, it may not be true. I'm not sure, but that's something that I'm a little bit hesitant. I have some trepidations about saying that George Washington smoked marijuana recreationally, because, like I said, there's been some mixed sources that I've come across, but they both did acknowledge the preponderance of the hemp industry. They both did acknowledge the medicinal usages. I keep saying usages. The medicinal usage, for cannabis. They both acknowledge that. So you have to take that into account. they both, pardon me, they both use hemp for writing. Certain documents that we revere now, as far as our American lineage goes, were written on hemp. And so the hemp industry was big. And also, even during the Civil War, cannabis was used for medicinal purposes as well. So we have to look at all of these things before we're so quick to demonize marijuana. And so it makes me think, well, essentially what happened? Like, why did we start to demonize weed? Like, what was the whole thing that pushed us to demonize cannabis? Well, as we can see, I mentioned this earlier, that there's a lot of vested interest in keeping cannabis illegal by various entities. And so I'll get into that a little bit later. But when we really start to see the crackdown on marijuana, it's kind of akin to what happened to the Chinese. So the Chinese started to come to America and to places like San Francisco in the mid to late 1800s. They started to come in, and some of them brought opium use with them. And so, in order to stir up fear against the Chinese, a lot of media outlets and politicians started to use opium usage to demonize the Chinese, to kind of restrict them coming in. And actually, there were laws passed. I can't remember the exact name of the laws, but there were laws passed that prevented, at a certain point, that prevented or really strictly relegated the immigration of the Chinese to a select few by the end of the 1800s into the western territories of this country. So when you get into 1910, we see the Mexican Revolution. So after the Mexican Revolution of 1910, we have a lot of immigrants from Mexico coming into the United States. They're going into specifically Texas, a few other parts of the South, and into some major urban centers. And what we begin to see is the rise of a xenophobia against these immigrants. And they also noticed that many of these immigrants utilize the recreational usage of cannabis. They smoke cannabis recreationally. And so the xenophobia coupled with the recreational use of cannabis, certain politicians, certain propaganda was put out there that said that marijuana, it made the immigrants violent, it made these people from Mexico have a proclivity towards crime, and they named the source as being the marijuana, the cannabis that was used. And a lot of people got behind it because marijuana is actually a Spanish word that meant wild weed. But in the United States, we called it cannabis. And people had medicine, had certain things with cannabis in them in their households. But the media was able to successfully demonize cannabis to the fact that by 1931, over 29 states had made the usage of cannabis or marijuana illegal. And in 1937, we see the Marijuana Tax Act passed that effectively criminalized marijuana. So this is kind of the origin of that. Also, there's a race factor. The race factor to that was that some additional propaganda that was put out is that jazz musicians and black men, whenever they would smoke marijuana, they would have a proclivity to sexually assault and rape white women. So that was some information that was put out there to make people even more anti-marijuana or even more anti-cannabis, is that this is a substance that when it is smoked, it makes black men go into this uncontrollable urge to rape white women. So you have these myriad of factors that made marijuana illegal here in the United States. Whereas this is something that has been used for writing materials, ships, medicinal purposes since this country's inception. But then now, all of a sudden, at the earlier part of the 20th century, we find this substance is now demonized, it's made illegal. Also, you have to account for the fact that a lot of the anti-marijuana ads, a lot of the anti-marijuana propaganda is actually funded by alcohol companies, by liquor companies, by cigarette companies that does not want that sort of competition in the market. They want everyone to stay inebriated. They want everyone to continue to purchase alcohol. They want everyone to continue to purchase cigarettes. And in order to do that, they have to perpetuate this fear, this misinformation related to cannabis. And the only, oh, sorry, I almost knocked the mic over. I got a little too passionate there. But the only way they feel they can maintain their power and their profit is to keep cannabis out of the market. That's the only way they feel they can do that. But if you look at political parties like the Green Party and the Libertarian Party, they've been advocating for the legalization of marijuana at the federal level for the longest. And Joe Biden was really anti-marijuana, and even on the campaign trail, when he was asked if legalizing marijuana at the federal level is something that he would do, he kind of either dismissed it or he was like, this is not a priority. My problem with that is to take it back to the war on drugs. The war on drugs has been one of the most destructive things to happen to the African American community ever. More black men and women have been incarcerated due to petty cannabis possession, due to maybe having a few ounces of cannabis in their possession, and they have to serve years of their life in a prison over that. Now, the nefarious part of this is that we have privately owned prisons. So privately owned prisons, they make a profit off of how many people they can house in their facilities. And what you have is you have privately owned prisons in conjunction with lobbyists, in conjunction with lawmakers, where they create laws that will actually boost incarceration rates. They create laws that would disproportionately affect certain demographics of the United States more so than others, and particularly African Americans. And these laws lead towards black people being incarcerated 3 times the rate of white Americans or other non-black Americans over petty cannabis or marijuana possession. So there are so many other factors, because the lie that was told to us is that the government is keeping cannabis away from us, keeping marijuana away from us because they care about us. But that's not the truth. This is all profit driven. This is to keep the prison industrial complex afloat. The more people you can lock up off of petty marijuana charges, the more certain senators can receive those checks from the lobbyists at the behest of privately owned prisons, the more that big pharma can sell opiates instead of naturally based medicines that cannabis can be used for. This is really to keep all of these different parties in a position where they're constantly able to make billions of dollars every year off of the backs of Americans. This has nothing to do with our health. It has nothing to do with protecting us. If you look at Xanax is far more dangerous for you to take than cannabis. If you look at Zoloft is far more dangerous for you to take versus cannabis. But yet and still is socially acceptable. Yet and still, the damage that alcohol does to your liver, the damage that alcohol can do, like, for example, you have alcohol-induced dementia that happens to people. Alcohol is so dangerous, and honestly, there have been times in my life where I've been drunk to the point where I almost had to go to the emergency room. Once again, I was far younger than I am now, but I think about some of the most dangerous times in my life were the times that involved alcohol. Those were the most dangerous times in my life. I've done crazy things when inebriated. Those were the craziest times. But cannabis is illegal. We started to see a change in 1996. 1996 California put out Proposition 215, and Proposition 215, what that did was it made the use of medical marijuana legal. So medical marijuana could be used if you had something from a doctor indicating that you needed to use medical marijuana. Then you were given a card and you could go to a dispensary and you could get your medical marijuana. But it wasn't until 2012 that Washington State and California actually became the first states to legalize recreational marijuana. It was Colorado and Washington State that actually did that. And funny enough, I was talking about the alcohol companies, and in Colorado, when marijuana was legalized at the recreational level, I think alcohol sales had dropped by like 28%. Yeah. Now, listen, cannabis can be abused. Cannabis can be harmful to a degree. But it's not more harmful to you than cigarettes or alcohol. But yet we've been fed all of this propaganda over the years about how dangerous cannabis is to us. And like I said, you go back millennia to Zoroastrianism, you go back to Rome, you go back to ancient Egypt, and you see all of these different societies had various uses for cannabis, including recreation. I do know this, that Abraham Lincoln talked about smoking on his hemp pipe. What does that mean? So I'm not gonna hold you guys too long in this particular episode. You know, I wanted to make this kind of a quick one, because I wanted to do an episode where I give my opinion on the legalization of marijuana. It's far overdue. We should have been legalized this. But here's a weird loophole I was thinking about. So in Virginia, you can gift people marijuana. So here's the murky water that we're in here in the state of Virginia. There will not be dispensaries until 2024. But recreational use is legal now. So if there's no dispensaries until 2024 and recreational use is legal now, then how are you able to purchase marijuana? And there's a lot of loopholes to that I think where they can still arrest people. But the fact that we've deemed the plant evil and we openly sell opioids, people consume alcohol, we have thousands of alcohol-related deaths every year. So many people go to the ER due to alcohol poisoning. So many people have lost a lung. So many people have developed certain forms of cancer due to cigarette usage. But we have this plant here that, because of racism, because of xenophobia, because you have alcohol and cigarette companies that seek to keep this sort of competition out of the market, we've just hook, line, and sinker brought into this demonization of cannabis. And we cling to it. Even now, so many people still feel like it's a gateway drug. Which is beyond me. I don't really understand how is that even like a real thing in 2021. But I want to close out with this. This is what I want to close out with. This is my theory on, and not just cannabis, but just plant medicines in general, which I consider cannabis kind of a sacrament or a plant medicine. Me myself, I have asthma issues, so I can't really smoke or anything like that, but people that I know that do, and people that I do know that indulge with plant medicines. So that could be psilocybin mushrooms, that could be dimethyltryptamine, that can be peyote, that can be ayahuasca, all of these various plant medicines one of the quotidian themes that I see is that people that indulge, in certain recreational usages of cannabis or uses of like psilocybin mushrooms, or salvia, or any of these, like I said, these psychedelic substances as well. One of the things I hear a lot of these people say is that it causes you to look at your paradigm and your way of life in a very objective and a very abstract and different manner. And I had someone tell me something recently, and it made me think. And I was having a conversation, with an associate of mine, and we were talking, and one of the things that they said that really stuck out to me is that when you do these substances, it's hard for you to buy into the fact that you're going to go somewhere and spend all of your waking hours working day in, day out for 40 years, and then you retire. It makes you look at advertising weird. Like, who came together and told me that I'm important if I buy a Bentley? How many millions of dollars, how much human intellectual power, the studying of the human psyche, how much did that go into marketing a vehicle which has no innate value other than something for you to go into debt over? How do we get that idea off the ground that this makes you a better person, this makes you valuable, this means that you're high value of substance? And what people that I know, people that have taken some of these psychedelic substances, one of the things they told me is that it makes you detached from that sort of perspective. And it's kind of scaled it out on a macro level. I think if I do believe in a conspiracy, and this is, like I said, this is kind of me going really out of bounds here, but if I do believe in a conspiracy, possibly the real conspiracy here is that these substances make people disconnect from the delusion and the minutia and the programming of the paradigm that we live under. And if you want to consolidate power, if you want to get people to throw themselves into debt, to sacrifice their individual wants and needs, to go and work and toil in jobs they don't like, to keep up with the Joneses, to constantly pursue material items. And listen, like I said, I'm not trying to come off anti any sort of economic system. I'm just putting this idea out there. Possibly one of the reasons why these substances are kind of stumped out and made to be illegal is that when you try to market the fact that, the 2021 Toyota Avalon is what you have to have, that you have to have the biggest mansion, that you have to you have to go out here and get inebriated every weekend. You have to throw yourself into debt. You have to get credit cards. You have to constantly post stuff about yourself on social media to prove your worthiness, to prove your validation to others. And these plant substances make that sort of perspective seem so asinine. And possibly the powers that be cannot have us as a population developing that sort of perspective where we kind of have a view that those things aren't good for us. Those things are irrelevant and they don't really coincide to your essence as a human being. And I think the big part of our society right now is to constantly compare and contrast, to constantly spend, to constantly go into debt. And possibly these substances aren't good for banks that want to keep you in that position. Possibly these substances aren't good for big pharma where they need you to come and take these opioids. And not all medicines that come from the pharmaceutical industry are bad and all of that stuff, but we have to realize that profit is involved at the end of the day with all of these different things that are prescribed to people. And we cannot act like that is not a factor. So I want to leave you guys with this. I think that marijuana should have been legalized eons ago. Whether you use it or not, the fact that we have stuff as dangerous as alcohol in our society, things as dangerous as cigarettes, cigars, but we've accepted this racist, xenophobic propaganda against cannabis for the past 70 years. It's just completely asinine to me. So listen, this has been episode 68 of No Truths Barred. Make sure you follow me on Instagram at Hoyt, HOYT_Kwaku, KWAKU _Timmons, Also, make sure you follow my other page, which is _No Truths Barred Podcast. And once again, this was a short one tonight, and I'll be back next week with episode 69. Thank you, much love, take care, and peace.